inviting me back again. Thanks for inviting me back again to present. Quite a bit has happened since my last presentation. So hopefully I can bring everybody who's online up to date. The focus will be very much more on agriculture this time, at least in the latter stages of my presentation. So where are we? Thought I ought to give you an update on where we are with the current set of tariffs that have been put in place by the current administration. As of this past August the 7th, the United States had implemented across the board. By that I mean most of our trading partners, over 100 trading partners, we've applied these tariffs. And currently, our average effective tariff rate for the United States is 17.9%. And that's actually the highest level of average tariffs since 1934. And that's a number that's calculated regularly by a group known as the Yale Budget Lab at Yale University. They have a really great online site if you're ever interested in following the tariff debate in more detail. Those tariffs are made up of a baseline of 10%. So back on April the 2nd, the administration implemented 10% tariffs across the board against pretty much all of our trading partners. And on top of that, there are additional tariffs up to 41%. Currently, the highest tariffs are being applied to imports from Brazil and also from India. In a minute, I'll explain why those higher tariffs are in place. And the logic behind what the administration did back in April and then subsequently confirmed in August, the tariffs over and above 10%, they're called reciprocal tariffs, and they were calculated on the extent of the trade deficit the US has bilaterally with any specific country. I'm not going to talk about that measure. It's been subject to a considerable amount of criticism by the economics profession, including myself. But the fact of the matter is that was the way that it was calculated. And just because economists say it's not a particularly good measure by which to set tariffs, that's what we're faced with. Currently, the most important exceptions for imports come under the free trade agreement that we have with Canada and Mexico. That's known as the US-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement, or USMCA for short. That means any goods traded between the three countries that meet the so-called rules of origin. In other words, if you were looking at, say, a processed dairy product like cheese going into Canada or vice versa, coming from Canada to the United States, that cheese would have to contain a certain percentage of milk and other inputs that were sourced here in the United States or in Canada. At the same time as these tariffs have been put in place across the board, the administration has been open to conducting negotiations with some of its trading partners. And what that's meant is that lower tariff rates have been negotiated currently with the United Kingdom, with China. I'm going to talk a little bit about the latest version of the agreement with China. The EU was able to secure slightly lower rates, as did Vietnam, South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, and Indonesia. And I believe there are ongoing negotiations right now with Thailand, Malaysia, and also Cambodia. So let me show you a few slides here that you might find interesting. This picture here is a slide that shows you the history of effective tariff rates in the United States pretty much since independence in the late 18th century. And as you can see, tariffs got pretty high in the middle of the 19th century. They fell away up until around the Civil War. The Civil War, ended in the 1860s. And pretty much we went from a low tariff scenario then to a high tariff one, mostly because the Union defeated the Confederacy. Most industry was in the northern states, and the northern states sought protection. We then saw those tariffs declining through to the early 1930s when the infamous Smoot-Hawley tariff was introduced in 1930, and that pushed up average tariffs, as you can see, to just around 20%. So you can see at the very end of this slide that currently our tariffs are on average about 18%, and that's the highest level we've seen since 1936. You can see that after the Second World War, through mostly a process led by the United States in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, multilaterally countries around the world, mostly the developed, rich countries of the OECD, substantially lowered tariffs in a process of reciprocity and non-discrimination, such that by around about where we were before the first Trump administration came in, average tariffs around the world, particularly for manufacturing goods, were around about 4%. If we move on to this next figure, this is a slightly more detailed, it's a very busy figure, I'm afraid, because there are so many countries against which the United States is levying tariffs. But on the horizontal axis, that just lists all the countries, and you can see out on the left, Brazil and India are facing 50% tariffs, where for Brazil, that blue part of the bar reflects the fact that there are additional sanctions through tariffs against Brazil because the president is not very happy with the fact that the previous president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, is likely to be sent to jail by the courts in Brazil for an attempted coup. And then you can see that India is next to it also with a 50% tariff. That's partly driven by the fact that India is facing sanctions from the United States over the fact that it's still importing oil from Russia. And that's why they face a somewhat higher tariff than other countries. If you go through across there's a couple of things this slide shows. First of all, it's across the board. There's a lot of countries included here. Secondly, this was done unilaterally by the United States. This was not done through any negotiations prior to April of this year. And what's really important is the fact that there's quite a degree of discrimination. We go from 50% tariffs against Brazil and India through 20% tariffs against countries like Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, 15% tariffs against countries like New Zealand, Norway, Afghanistan, down to 10% tariffs. So those 10% tariffs over on the right-hand side, the three countries there, well, the Falklands is a very small country, but as you can see, the United Kingdom is probably the most important country in that group, along with a bunch of countries called the rest of the world. They face the lowest tariffs. The other colors in that graphic, just to explain, you may remember when President Trump first came into office, he implemented tariffs against Canada, China, and Mexico with a view to preventing the import of fentanyl into the United States. And those tariffs are the major tariffs that's still in place against Canada and Mexico, along with tariffs that relate to steel and aluminum imports, particularly from Canada. And as part of the agreement with China, it looks like the fentanyl portion of the tariff against China is going to be taken away. And then in any of those tariff numbers with blue bars, those are countries that are being included in trade deals that have been negotiated since this past April. So you can see China's there, Vietnam's included, Indonesia. Moving on down, you see the EU, the European Union, Japan. I'll talk about the Japanese agreement shortly as it relates to agriculture. Then you have South Korea and the United Kingdom. And there may be more blue bars appearing in that slide over time as we go forward. So let me talk a little bit about the legal authority for tariffs. This has been pretty important for those of us who follow trade policy, and legal issues relating to international trade. And if you are following these things, these eventually landed in the Supreme Court last week for what are called oral arguments. So the current round of tariffs, these across-the-board tariffs, were put in place by the administration based upon appealing to what's called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, something called, the acronym is IEPA. And this piece of legislation, which was put in place partly to counteract some things that President Nixon did when he was in office, and using something called the Trading with the Enemies Act, which was passed in 1913, just before the First World War. This 1977 Act authorizes the president to regulate trade via embargoes or sanctions under a national emergency. So there are three things that the lawyers are picking over here. One is what powers or what authority has Congress, because you have to understand that the right to set tariffs, taxes, and other ways of raising revenue in the United States is actually given to Congress. It's Congress that has that authority. And the last time Congress set every single tariff in the United States was actually the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act that I mentioned a few minutes ago. But gradually over time, and we can talk about this in later detail if you're interested, a little bit more power has been handed over to the executive branch to regulate trade. So the issue is, to what extent does this act allow the president to use tariffs to regulate trade because of a national emergency? And the debate is going to center around the word regulate. What does that mean? The language of the act does not include the word tariffs. And there's also an issue about whether, just because we're running trade deficits with countries, does that really constitute a national emergency? Most economists would poo-poo this argument on the grounds that we've been running trade deficits in the United States since the late 1970s. So in May of this year, late May, something called a rather obscure court called the US Court of International Trade, that actually deals on a regular basis with customs issues, customs and duties issues at the border. They ruled that the justification for the use of the tariffs did not meet the test of unusual and extraordinary threats. In other words, they basically argued that the president and the executive was overstepping the bounds of its authority. Not surprisingly, the administration appealed that decision, and an appeals court a couple of days later in May, after the original ruling, issued what's called a temporary administrative stay, which meant that the tariffs could stay in place. Then in late August, that same Court of Appeals affirmed the original court's ruling in a 7-4 judgment. In other words, that the president had overstepped the legal bounds of his authority to set across-the-board tariffs in the way that he had. Not surprisingly, the administration appealed this to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court heard oral arguments last week. I didn't listen to the whole discussion, but I've read very carefully the transcript of the debate. And I think if you read the newspapers carefully on this, you'll notice that several of the judges on the bench of the Supreme Court, including judges that are considered to be more liberal, as well as judges that are considered to be more conservative, notably Judge Roberts and Judge Coney Barrett, seemed rather skeptical about the arguments being put forward by the administration. And this is an interesting little graphic that was Paul Krugman, who's a Nobel Prize winner in economics, who used to write for the New York Times, but now just writes a Substack pretty much every day, saying what he thinks about international trade and other policy issues. And he put up this graphic, which is this is a political forecasting market called Polymarket, and it's calculating the percentage chance that the Supreme Court will or won't rule in favor of the Trump tariffs. And you can see that prior to the hearings, it was sort of jogging along at about a 40% probability, so less than a 50-50 chance that the court would support the president. But then there was a significant decline. It went down to about 25%. So it seems like folks in markets that worry about these issues are pretty pessimistic that the Supreme Court will rule in favor of President Trump having the across-the-board tariffs based on the 1977 Act. So if the court does rule against the administration, what are the legal alternatives? Well, I'm not going to go through this slide in detail other than to say that under the first Trump administration, they typically used one of the first three pieces of legislation. One is called the Section 232. That's where you can argue that imports are a threat to national security. That was pretty much applied to steel, aluminum, and also automobiles. And I would imagine that will be used again if the administration has to seek other ways of applying tariffs. Section 201, this is where foreign trade is causing injury to domestic industries. This is where you get significant inflows of imports. And then finally, Section 301, and these are the most common. This is the most common law that was applied, particularly to Chinese imports, 2018 through to 2020 in the first administration of President Trump. This is where there's discrimination against US businesses or violation of US rights under international trade agreements. Those will all be used again. They're already being used anyways. But if the Supreme Court does go against the president on the way he's applied tariffs since this April, I think would probably to go to what's called Section 122 of the 1974 Trade Act, where the executive is allowed to implement tariffs for 150 days. They can be extended with approval from Congress, but there is a limit or a cap to the tariff of 15%. But the reason for doing that would be to claim that there are international balance of payments problems. And it's important to understand that there's a distinction between a trade deficit, which is the difference between imports and exports, and a balance of payments problem, which is our international balance, accounting balance. And you have to remember that we run a trade deficit, but we get a lot of capital coming into the capital account, which balances our balance of payments. So there would be a lot of debate, and a lot of economists would write amicus briefs to a court on this saying, no, we don't have an international payments problem. But we'll have to wait and see about that. Section 338, hardly anybody's written about it, and it hasn't ever been used post 1947, which is when the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade came into being. Now, if you want me to speculate on, and this is going to be the only time I speculate today in my presentation, where do I think the Supreme Court will come out? I think they're going to come out with a decision designed to placate possibly both sides of the argument, both plaintiffs and defendants. So I think sometime in the next few months, they will rule that the president cannot use the act that he's appealing to apply these tariffs. And from the moment the Supreme Court makes that ruling, those tariffs are not allowed to be implemented anymore. Having said that, I also think the Supreme Court might argue, and I think this is partly to reflect Justice Coney Barrett's views of the complexity of getting rid of the tariffs and then having to possibly pay back the tariff revenue. I think they may argue that there's no need to consider any remedies for those who've already had to pay the tariffs up to the time the tariffs are prevented. So that's where I think the court's going to come out. It's going to give a judgment that says no more use of these tariffs, but you don't have to give back the tariff revenue that's already been collected. And I think that would actually be rather messy if that were remanded back to the appeals court to sort out. So enough of the legal discussion, other than to say that it's very obvious and very clear that we're in a world of trade policy uncertainty right now. I may have mentioned this in my previous talk a few months ago, but when the appeals court ruled against President Trump's tariffs in September, this is a headline from the Reuters news network that's saying this fuels market uncertainty. And it's certainly the case that right now in the United States, a metric of trade policy uncertainty that is put together by the St. Louis Federal Reserve, one of the baby feds, they've been collecting data to measure this right back to the 1960s. And you can see that trade policy uncertainty has just gone through the roof. It actually almost hit 800 points on their index. It's gone back down a little bit, but it still lies above 500. So we still have the highest level of trade policy uncertainty that we've seen since the early 1960s. And I would argue, or I would suggest that if the Supreme Court does rule against the president's tariffs, that you will see this index shooting up again, because it won't be obvious immediately anyways to what kind of policies that the president and his administration is going to replace the existing tariffs with. So let me now talk about the trade wars with China, because I think in terms of agricultural trade, this is probably the most fundamental issue that right now is facing both US agriculture and specifically Ohio agriculture. And I'll show you some numbers later that relate to our own state. So this graphic here, it's not been updated to account for where the tariffs are vis-a-vis the most recent trade deal that was struck a couple of weeks ago between President Trump and the Chinese President Xi Jinping. So the red line, or the red dotted line, those are US tariffs from 2018 through to up to pretty much the end of October. And the blue line are tariffs that China places against US exports. And you can see that at the beginning of the first trade war and the first Trump administration there in early 2018, tariffs between the two countries were running at about 3% by the US, about 7% by China. And then you can see, if you can see this little hand on the screen, these up to 2020, these were averaging somewhere about 20% for both countries against each other. The Biden administration comes into office and did not get rid of these tariffs. And then you hit April of 2025 and then May, and you can see that there's this really serious tit-for-tat trade war where Chinese tariffs hit nearly 150% and US tariffs hit almost 140%. Subsequently in May, both parties relaxed those tariffs so that prior to the recent agreement, US tariffs against China average about 57%, and Chinese tariffs against the United States average about 33%. Importantly, if the trade war had ever stuck up here with China, we would have virtually wiped out all trade with China. That would have been prohibitive tariffs by both sides against each other. And the US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent actually admitted to this in a speech that he made back in May sometime, that this was effectively each country had an embargo, a ban on imports against each other. So let's now talk for the rest of my presentation about the impact on US agriculture. So as you probably all know, US agricultural exports have been explicitly targeted in both the current trade war and in the previous trade war. So 2018 to 2019, China slapped approximately 30% tariffs, 27 to 30% tariffs on US imports, not just of soybeans, but of corn and sorghum and wheat and other commodities. But that particularly hurt the US soybean industry, and I'll show you in a minute the extent to which the first trade war damaged our soybean exports. Subsequently, that led to the Trump administration, and actually the Biden administration followed up for at least another year with compensatory payments to US farmers. They summed about $24 to $28 billion from over about a 3-year period, designed to compensate farmers for their lost revenue due to China putting those tough tariffs in place. They've done that again, and I'll show you what the tariffs look like shortly. But we know, and we only have data up till July because we're still waiting for the updated numbers from USDA. As you know, the government has only just gone back into operation as of yesterday, I guess. And USDA has not been publishing any up-to-date statistics. So hopefully in the next few weeks, and I can update these data. But from January to July 2025, there's been a 73% decline in the value of agricultural exports to China. China was one point was our number one export market, and I'll talk a little bit more about what our key export markets are shortly. And soybeans have been particularly hard hit. And you've probably heard these numbers if you listen to the agricultural news, if you read Farm Doc online or your local newspaper. No US soybeans have been purchased by China since May 2025. And for the first time since 2018, none were purchased in September. So in other words, no beans were being were being purchased by China from the United States right as we started to harvest them back in early September through October. And what this has done is simply exacerbate the on-running loss of market share in China to Brazil. Plus, Argentina and Uruguay, two other countries in Latin America who grow soybeans, have also been increasing their exports to China. And just as an aside, you probably all know that the United States recently bailed out or has sent a $40 billion bailout to Argentina to help them maintain the value of the Argentinian peso and to help the current administration there in Argentina under President Milei. And the day after that bailout was announced, or it's actually what we call it. It's a loan really rather than a bailout, but it's still a significant amount of money from US taxpayers. The day after, the Argentinian president got rid of the export taxes on Argentinian agricultural exports. They export a lot of wheat, and they export soy meal. They're very good at exporting crush, actually, both soy meal and soy oil. And immediately after that, China actually bought nearly 20 shiploads of soybeans. And if you follow these things, that really angered the American Farm Bureau, the soybean associations, who said, why are we bailing out Argentina, and then Argentina is able to export more soybeans to China when we're not able to export soybeans to China right now? So this has become a very highly political issue, as you might imagine. Now, just as the US-China trade negotiations were underway, this was in very late October, China's state-owned marketing board, it's called COFCO, it's a state-owned enterprise. So the way imports into China, they're done either through private firms working with companies like ADM and Cargill. But COFCO is a state-owned firm that the Chinese government has a lot of influence over. They purchased 3 soybean cargoes in late October. So that was probably a good faith purchase, but it signaled that possibly the Chinese were going to relax their constraints on importing soybeans from the United States. So let me show you, prior to the most recent agreement, what did the retaliatory tariffs look like by China against US agricultural exports. So on the left-hand column, I show you soybeans, corn, coarse grains, pork and pork products, and wheat. These are the most important exports by the United States to China. And you can see there in that first row that soybeans absolutely dominate the 3-year average of the value of exports to China. So well over half of our exports to China, $15 billion worth, are in soybeans. And then if you follow over that row, prior to any of the trade wars, China imposed what's called the most favored nation tariff. That's a tariff that it imposes against all soybean imports into China of 3%, which is very, very low. This past August, tariffs, including what are called waivers. So Chinese importers are allowed to seek a waiver of those tariffs from the Chinese government, particularly for what are called the Section 301 tariffs that the United States implemented. So tariffs were about 23% as of August, if you included the waiver. But without the waivers, because the waivers were about to disappear as of they weren't accepting any new applications after the end of October, and they would end pretty much this December. It's not clear whether those waivers are going to be in place anymore, but if they weren't there, those August tariffs would have gone up to nearly 50%, which, as you can see, is pretty high. And then you can see you get similar sort of variation across the tariffs for the other commodities. And corn obviously would also have faced a pretty high tariff if those waivers were removed. So here's a graphic. This is from the CSIS, which is an independent group in Washington, D.C., something of strategic studies, if I remember rightly. This would be USDA data. This is the difference in US agricultural exports to China over the period January to July 2025 compared to the same period in 2024. And you can see that China, the value of those lost exports was $3 billion for soybeans. And over the same period, we simply couldn't make up the difference exporting to the rest of the world. And sorry, there we go. My screen just went blank. And then you can see going down the ranks, cotton is about 2/3 less loss than China. Then you've got sorghum, that's often used in animal feed. Wheat, the Chinese are the biggest consumers of wheat in the world. It didn't affect the corn sector nearly as much. And as you can see, the corn sector, the corn industry actually did rather well at making up exports to the rest of the world. So this is really a story, as you can well see, of the impact on US soybean exports to China. Here's the graphic I mentioned I would show you a few minutes ago. This is this was put together by Dr. Joe Glauber, who used to be for many years, he was the chief economist in the Secretary of Agriculture's office in Washington, D.C. And if you go back to 1995, you can see that China really wasn't importing any soybeans at all. And as China began to open up, as their GDP, their national income went up, they started to consume a lot more protein in the form of meat, notably pork, poultry, and a little bit more beef, but predominantly pork and poultry. So they started to develop their own hog and poultry production capacity, but they also import those. But predominantly, both the United States and Brazil, as you can see, really started to take advantage of increasing demand for animal protein through soybeans, all up to just before the trade war in 2018. You can see that Brazil's exports keep rocketing through the trade war and on in terms of metric tons of exports, whereas the US took a pretty big hit during the first trade war. We recouped some of those losses, at least up to where we were in 2017, over a 2-year period after the trade war, and that was largely due to China committing to increase its imports of agricultural commodities from the United States through something called the US-China Phase 1 Trade Agreement. They hit about 80% of the target for soybeans and other agricultural commodities. But you can see that post 2022, 2023, Brazil has continued to increase its market share, and the US has continued to lose market share. So that's sort of the background to where we are in 2025, where we're continuing to lose market share, and what's going on is simply intensifying I think the rate at which we're losing that market share. This is just another way of looking at what's been happening to Brazilian soybean exports. This is this is in billions of bushels. It's expected to reach a record for the 2025-26 marketing year. Remember, they would have harvested this year back in earlier in the year. Remember, they're in the southern hemisphere. and then they're going to start harvesting early into 2026. And they're expected to reach a record export level in this coming marketing year. What's driving that? Increased acreage, and also, very importantly, their yields are now almost the same as US soybean acreage yields. They're using their own genetically modified technology. They're using the similar chemical technology. They're using industrially produced fertilizers, and they're using modern machinery. If you go down to Brazil, you can see John Deere tractors, John Deere combines, etc., etc. Wherever you go in the major parts of Brazil where they produce these commodities. This tells the story of US soybeans to China. You can see it's always very cyclical. So this would be millions of bushels. The blue bars are the United States. The US bars are total exports. The red bars are soybean exports to China. And you can see that the peak of marketing is typically, if you look at 2024, it's in October, November, December, January, and then it slowly starts to taper off as we sell our what's in storage to the Chinese demand, and then you'll see some exports over the summer, June, July, back then in 2024. But if you go to the right-hand side of the graph, you can see that we just didn't export anything through June, July, August, and then I would suggest September, and also very little in October. So right at the peak of our harvest, we have not been exporting to China. Then this is just the same story for Brazil. You can see that Brazil starts to really export after its harvest in March, April, May, June. Then that tapers off, and then the American harvest comes in and we start to export. And you can see that Brazil has been exporting a considerable amount, something like a third of their exports have been going to China from about March onwards through to August. And we know that that Brazil has still been exporting to China through September, October, and probably through November and December, which is a little bit unusual given the US would normally be coming in and exporting in that period. This is another way of looking at this. This is not a very happy picture, I'm afraid. This is the difference in soybean exports to China, January, August 2025, compared to the average for the same period, 2020 through 2024. So that would have been 2022, 2020 to 24 would be the period over which we had a 2-year growth in soybean exports, and then they leveled off and started to fall again through to when President Trump came into office. And you can see this highlights really, really clearly that we've lost market share in value, whereas Brazil has gained pretty much at our expense. But importantly, Argentina is supplying the market, Uruguay is supplying the market, Canada's actually also lost, and even Paraguay, which is a relatively small producer of soybeans, is also coming into the market. So this is a pretty pessimistic picture, because if you were to look at these averages, given that we didn't export anything in September and probably very little in October, those losses are probably going to be larger than 2 billion compared to the previous 4-year average. Here's the picture for Ohio if you're interested in soybean exports from Ohio. So first of all, soybeans have always been the #1 agricultural export from the state of Ohio. And you can see that over here. This is what we've been exporting to the world. The colors are 2019, 20, 21, 22. The green is 2023. 24 is the blue, and then 2025 is up to the third quarter of 2025. So we're forecast to export about $0.4 billion worth of soybeans. So you can see that this is likely affecting Ohio as well. And what's really interesting is for 2024, we exported about $135 million worth to China, but our largest export market was Indonesia. The second was Taiwan, and then you can put in Vietnam and Malaysia. So you can see that not only did we export to China, but we're also exporting to other emerging economies in Southeast and Southeastern Asia. But what's really obvious here is that we're not going to export anything to China. There's no red bar being forecast here for China by USDA, is Economic Research and the Foreign Ag Service. So we are going to be exporting, and I'd like to remind you that the state recently negotiated a trade deal where Taiwan would commit to importing more soybeans and ethanol and possibly corn over the next couple of years. So we have to hope that they actually meet those commitments. But it's very clear that China is now no longer in the top 5 important markets for higher soybean exports. And remember, that's our #1 export from the state. Second, but by considerably lower, would be corn. So what about the impact of this trade deal with China? So China is committed to importing 12 million tons of soybeans by the end of 2025. I talked to somebody yesterday who says typically it takes a shipload of soybeans nearly 34 days to get from the Gulf in New Orleans to a port, either Shanghai or the port just south of Beijing. Remember, you've got to go through the Panama Canal, then cross the Pacific Ocean. It's not clear to me how we're going to, even if the Chinese were to try to meet that commitment, it's not obvious that there's enough shipping capacity or time to actually do that. But we'll wait and see. And they've also committed to importing at least 25 million tons a year over the next 3 years. China also committed to reducing its retaliatory tariffs against US agricultural products, but soybeans will continue to face a 13% tariff. So what's been happening over literally the last couple of weeks? Well, the market for soybeans has softened. And this is the market's expecting that, well, if 12 million tons of American soybeans are going to hit the market, that's a big shift in the supply curve on the world market. That's going to push down prices. And what that means is it's pushed down Brazilian prices relative to American prices. So because American prices will continue to face a tariff at 13%. So Brazilian beans are currently selling below US Gulf prices. And China, in the last couple of weeks, has purchased multiple shipments from Brazil. And that was reported in Farm Doc from the University of Illinois only yesterday. So traders, this is, guys who trade with ADM and other companies, they believe that US soybeans are likely to remain uncompetitive relative to Brazilian soybeans because of the tariff, but also because Chinese demand is actually expected to be weak in coming months. And that's because China has built up significant stocks at its ports and in its state reserves. And at the same time, their crush margins, by crush margins, I mean that's the ability of a firm in China getting raw soybeans, crushing them and turning them into animal feed through soy meal and into vegetable oil, soya oil. Their margins are really, really tight. And so they believe and they're not getting enough for what they sell into the animal feed market and the vegetable oil market. But there's a lot of this stuff available in China. There's a glut. And this is partly because China has simply been diversifying, and it's also been building up this inventory because of the trade war with the United States. And this is a graphic that was in Farm Doc yesterday, that yellowy brown line that shows you Chinese stocks from last July through May. They ran down those stocks through May, and then you've seen this huge buildup of stocks through November, where those stocks are now greater in terms of millions of tons of soybeans compared to last year. So this suggests to me that I wouldn't say pessimistic, but I'm not particularly optimistic about the rate at which China is going to start importing soybeans from the United States. Although I would have to say that the relative prices between Brazil and the United States are really going to matter as the Brazilian harvest comes into play, because if the Brazilian harvest is not particularly good, that's likely to make American soybeans more competitive. But I think a big concern for the industry is what's going to be the rate of loss of soybeans that are currently in storage, how quickly we're going to be able to get those on barges onto the Ohio, Mississippi, and Missouri rivers down to the Gulf, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, it's kind of wait and see right now to see what's going to happen as we move into the new year. So it's a little bit early to be saying anything about the potential loss from China's retaliatory tariffs, but some friends of mine at North Dakota State University, they put together some estimates of what might happen to the value of US exports to China in 2026, up to the 2025 tariffs with and without the waivers. So that would be what would happen if China implemented 23% tariff. What would happen if they implemented a 50% tariff against soybeans? I've highlighted soybeans because, again, just to emphasize, that's clearly the most important export industry. It's the most important export industry for a market for Ohio, in not just to China, but for the world. So they were forecasting that if, let's suppose, nothing were to have been in place in terms of tariffs, for 2026, it was expected that the US would export $14 billion worth of soybeans to China. And then you see the similar numbers for coarse grains, pork and pork products, and wheat down there. But let's just focus on soybeans. If it were a 23% tariff, 61% of those value of those exports could have been lost. If it was the most serious tariff of 50%, the market would have been wiped out. That would have been a prohibitive tariff. But with the agreement, it looks like tariffs are going to be at about 13%. We don't know about what the tariff waivers will look like. So this is me just speculating. I think we will still lose market share and value of exports to China next year, but it certainly won't be 61% of that 14 billion. I think it's going to be more like, and this is again off the top of my head, given we're doing what? We're approximately halving that tariff, so maybe 25, 30, 40% loss in export value. But a lot's going to depend upon Chinese demand, the Brazilian crop, the level at which the tariffs are kept, and the US soybean crop and what we have in storage next year. So now let me talk a little bit about agricultural input tariffs. I want to try to leave some time for questions. So farmers are facing tight margins. They were facing tight margins a year ago. They're facing even tighter farm margins now in row crops. The livestock industry, particularly beef, you probably all know we've got very high beef prices. There's a much smaller head of cattle in the United States right now, so beef prices are very high. That's the really only bright spot for US farm incomes. And another colleague of mine, Sean Arita, who's also at North Dakota State University, and you may have seen this number, they've calculated that 9 row crop industries in the United States are facing revenue losses of about $44 billion this year. And that's not just because of tariffs, it's because of other factors like input costs and low commodity prices. That doesn't include beef, by the way, that's row crop producers. So on the input side, tariffs are affecting the supply chain before agriculture. So we're talking about here machinery, chemicals, and fertilizers. And the US has typically imported about $33 billion a year of that. The key suppliers, Canada, 8.6 billion a year's worth of potash. It's a key fertilizer. We have been getting about $7.8 billion worth of machinery from the European Union. It's very interesting. It's very geographically concentrated. Fertilizers, mostly from Canada, and you probably know this from Russia. Phosphates from Saudi Arabia, and specialized pesticides are typically coming in from Switzerland and India. Now, under USMCA, Canada and Mexico, I mentioned this earlier, receive exemptions on tariffs. So the effective rates are about 0%. So we can still get the potash at virtually zero tariffs. But the highest effective rates are targeted at India, at 44%, China at 26%. So just emphasizing what I said, this will put additional pressure on farmers' margins this year. This is just a graphic to show you, if you look at the bars, the green bars have shot rightwards. So there's been a very big increase in tariffs on effective tariffs on particularly pesticides and herbicides. Those effective tariffs are over 20%, and for overall inputs are above 12%. So we're talking about what, 25% for pesticides, 24% for herbicides, 20% for insecticides. And you probably know there's been a big increase in the price of fertilizers, which are a key input to row crop producers. So I'm going to finish this out because I think there's some important things for you to think about without just simply focusing on China. We need to put what's happening in China in a broader context, particularly with respect to our two major trading partners, Mexico and Canada. So this is the US agricultural trade balance. So very simply put, the blue line in my graph here, those are our exports, and the red line is our imports. And this is in billions of dollars, and it's over a very long period going up to 2025, right there on the right-hand side. So you can see that for most of the 2000s, right up to 2022, we were running a pretty large trade surplus. And in fact, agriculture was one of the bright spots of the US current account. It was one of the few industries, other than services, where we were running a trade surplus. And then you can see below that we've started to run very large trade deficits, 17 billion in fiscal year 23, 32 billion in fiscal year 24, and 47 billion in fiscal year 25, and it's expected to be even larger in 2026. Just to give you a flavor, and we'll just focus on the 2025 numbers. This is the forecast in billions of dollars, again by USDA for this past August. I don't have the current numbers because the November report is on hold because of the government shutdown. So you can see that in terms of exports, those would be the red bars, oilseeds, livestock, grain and feeds, and horticultural products are our key exports, with horticultural products being our most important export. And then on the import side, you can see that it's absolutely dominated by horticultural products. So that would be fruit and vegetables, and as I'm going to point out to you, mostly coming in from our trading partners in Mexico, some from Canada, and obviously we get a lot of tropical products from around the world. So right now, lower commodity prices are affecting the value of our oilseed and other exports, also the trade war with China, but we continue to have very strong demand for horticultural products, largely because the US is not currently setting tariffs against imports from Canada and Mexico. So what have been our top 5 markets for US agricultural exports? Well, if you ignore the other countries, you can see that it's been China, Mexico, Canada, the European Union, that would be 27 countries now because of Brexit, and then Japan. But if you lump together Canada and Mexico, you can see that there are number 1 and number 2 export destinations. And right now, our number 3 export is the European Union. Number 4 is Japan, and China has actually dropped to number 5. So the trade war is significantly impacting the importance of China as an export market. And our highly integrated market here in North America in agriculture is an extremely important market in terms of our exports, our imports, and also our ability to be competitive on the world market, I would argue. So just to emphasize that, again, this is Joe Glauber's data. I talked about him earlier. You've got Canada, you've got the 3 pies, I should say. You can see that 60% of Canadian exports go to the United States. Some go to Mexico, not very much. whereas 89% of Mexican exports in agriculture go to the United States, not very much Canada. And then what, if you add it up, just over nearly 2/3 of US exports go to Canada and Mexico in total. By the way, just to give you another sense, put this in context, the United States for the past 10 years has been the #1 agricultural exporter in the world. Canada has consistently been in the top 5 agricultural exporters in the world. And since the past couple of years, Mexico is now in the top 10. So all 3 countries are clearly major agricultural exporters, both to themselves, but also to the rest of the world. On the import side, in other words, what this is really showing you is that there's two-way trade between all 3 countries. This is a very integrated market. For Canada, 55% of its imports come from the United States, 7% from Mexico. For Mexico, 74% of its imports come from the United States, whereas for the US, 43% of its imports come from Canada and Mexico. It's important to remember a couple of things here. Canada and the United States tend to trade relatively similar products with each other. So oil seeds go both ways. We send them soybeans, they send us canola. They send us cattle, we send them processed meat. Whereas with Mexico, it's different products get traded. We export a considerable amount of corn to Mexico. We import mostly fruit and vegetables from Mexico. We do also import beef, although currently there's a ban on beef imports because of, I think it's called, there's a ban on imports from Mexico because of screwworm. You also have to remember these markets are highly integrated through value chains, whereby young hogs might be born in Canada, they might be fed out in Mexico, and then they get slaughtered in the United States, and then we consume some of the products of those animals here in the US. We export some back to Canada, and we export some back to Mexico. So I'd like to point out how important North American trade under the United States-Mexico Free Trade Agreement actually is. So that leads me to my final slide, and sort of some other factors that you might want to pay attention to. So this thing called the USMCA, which was signed in 2020, that was under the Trump administration, it has a sunset clause in it. By a sunset clause, I mean that by July 2036, if the 3 partners have not agreed to continue the agreement, it will disappear. It will simply end in 2036. And as I've already shown you, that exports to Mexico and Canada and vice versa to the US are quite critical. They're quite critical to agriculture. And maintaining this agreement, I think, is going to be extraordinarily important, both for the integrated nature of North American agriculture, our ability to export to each other, and our ability to be competitive on the world market. Now, there are still some. So the gains of USMCA were as follows. There were commitments about biotechnology. There were commitments on phytosanitary standards. Canada agreed to partially open up its dairy sector, which is still highly protected. It's one of the few sectors in North America that is still highly protected. And the dispute settlement mechanism was considerably strengthened to the point where we've had 5 disputes since 2020 that have been resolved under USMCA, 3 of which relate to agriculture. Most notably, Mexico has agreed not to ban the genetically modified corn. So I think USMCA is quite critical. And if it's not re-upped in 2026, they have to review it again in 2027. But it might even be blown up altogether, who knows? So there's a lot of uncertainty there. Now, these negotiated trade deals could provide new market access for the US. So you may have read about this. Japan agreed to import a lot more rice from the United States. Not very relevant to Ohio. We don't produce rice. That would be Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, I think in Arkansas and probably California. But importantly, they've committed to importing $8 billion worth of US agricultural commodities, including soybeans and ethanol. The UK also agreed to new trade rules over beef and ethanol and poultry as well. But I think the UK food standards, which are still very high, they're still set by the level they were under the European Union, may prove a barrier. In other words, British consumers are unlikely to consume American beef if it's hormone treated, and they're unlikely to consume American poultry if that poultry in the slaughtering process has been put into a chlorine bath. I can tell you, because I read the British newspapers, that British consumers think American food is unsafe. Now, whether you believe that or not is neither here nor there. Perception is reality when it comes to UK consumers. Finally, the US dollar has depreciated quite significantly. So here's a bit of an upside to the story I've been telling. That has the potential to increase exports. So the lower is the dollar, the lower is the price of our exports. All of our exports are denominated in dollars, so that should possibly help on the export side. But it adds extra inflationary pressure on the import side because the value of the dollar is lower. So if you add that in with tariffs on inputs like fertilizers, that's going to put further pressure on farm margins. So this is one of those on the one hand, and on the other, on balance, it's not obvious to me that the dollar depreciation is really going to help US agricultural exports. So with that, I am going to finish my presentation, Amanda. So thanks to everybody for listening, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions that people have.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and allow everybody to talk. So you'll have the ability to unmute yourself if you wanted to. And I know there's two questions in the chat box for Robin. I don't know if they were sort of specific to a certain point of the presentation, so may need some clarity if so. But the first question from Robin was, what happens to all the extra product that was intended to be sold but will not be?
That's a really good question, Robin. As I suggested in my presentation, hang on just a minute. I'm on a webinar. Sorry about that. One of my colleagues knocked on my door. So right now, if I were to show you the slide, we've been unable to make up what we lost in exports to China with exports to being diverted to new markets or existing markets. And that happened last time round in 2018, 2019. So as far as I understand it, that's putting a lot of pressure on the storage system here in the United States, be it on-farm storage or storage at local elevators, or even storage at elevators on the river system here in the United States. So I think that puts pressure on storage costs this year. There's a hope that we can increase crush in the United States. So in other words, we take beans that we've produced, turn them into meal and soya oil. I don't have a good idea of the extent to which we're able to pick up the slack there. But I think what I've been trying to say is that we probably need, this is not a short-term solution, but in the medium to the long term, the American Soybean Association, the Ohio Soybean Association, farmers have to think about what are the alternative export markets for soybeans. They're probably going to be in those other emerging economies in Asia, because we're not going to be able to, in the long run, probably to outcompete Brazil, unfortunately. So I think right now this is putting a lot of pressure on US soybean prices, both at the farm gate, at the elevator, and also at the port. So that's a really pessimistic answer to your question, is that I don't think we do have a place to sell that right now. Hopefully the Chinese do meet their commitments, and that will relieve a lot of pressure on the system. So that's my answer to that question. Does the increase in the cost of pesticides create opportunity for farmers on alternative products? Well, I think you're probably talking there more about fertilizers rather than pesticides. The only organic pesticide that I'm aware of is Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a naturally occurring pesticide. But I think, Robin, that um, large scale soybean and corn production is very reliant on modern fertilizer and modern chemical technology. So I think it's going to be pretty hard for those guys with, in Ohio, anything from 1,000 up to the really big farms, 10,000 acres. They've invested a huge amount in, rotating soybean corn technology, which is very chemical intensive, very modern seed intensive, and very capital intensive. It doesn't require much labor. So I think in order to, maximize those economies of scale, I think it's going to be pretty hard to move to organically produced alternatives. But that doesn't mean to say in the long run, at the margin, you won't see farmers thinking very carefully about substituting inputs. But I think in the short run, it's going to be pretty difficult to do that. Um, I know of farmers, for example, I talked to one recently who's a relatively small farmer. He produces soybeans not for animal feed, he produces food grade soybeans, which he exports to Japan. And I think you might see a little bit more of thinking about moving to those high oleic oil soybeans, which are, I believe, I'm not an expert on this, but I believe they're good for producing things like soy sauce and tofu. One of the canonical examples in it here in Ohio is that every year um, Honda based up in Marysville will export a few containers load of specialty soybeans back to Japan to be turned into Japan quality soy sauce and tofu that then comes back to feed their Japanese employees in the employee um, restaurant there up at the factory there um, in Marion in Marysville, sorry, Marion County in Marysville. So, I think in the short run it's going to be pretty difficult. And I think that I've heard that farmers out in North Dakota, for example, were being told by the local elevators, leave this stuff in the ground. So I think we're kind of in a really difficult situation right now, particularly with soybeans. Now, if you noticed with corn hasn't lost out nearly as badly uh, to China. It's not so, our main market is actually down in Mexico to feed all those animals down there. Um, but we've managed, it looks like the corn industry's done a pretty good job of finding other markets. So that's a bit more of an optimistic story there. So great questions. I hope I was able to answer those questions. I'd be happy to take any more that you might have.
And just a reminder, everyone should be able to unmute themselves if they want to ask directly. And then there's also either the Q&A box or the chat box. So
So I'd like to ask a question of the participants is what are they hearing out in their counties or the counties that you're coming from? I mostly hear from people in, you know, up towards Mercer County in the northwest and then down towards the southeast, or the south of Columbus. What is anybody hearing from soybean farmers in their district, if anything? Or they're just miserable and fed up? I don't think I'm going to take silence as an indication that everything is well, because I don't think it is, unfortunately. Well, I'm sorry if I blinded everybody with science, but um, that's where we are right now. It's not a very optimistic outlook right now at the moment, I'm afraid.
well, thank you, for sharing this information. Like what I said with the last webinar you did, you do such a wonderful job kind of distilling down some really complex information. And so, if anyone does have a question, feel free. You still have a couple, minutes to ask. Robin did respond and say there's no soybean producers near her. Um, so Dr. Sheldon, I think as last time, you'll be able to share your slides with me, and I'll
Yep,
include
absolutely.
those in the email that goes out with the recording. And so I know there was a number of people who registered today but weren't available. And so feel free to pass the recording on to your networks as well, to share this information. So thank you again, Dr. Sheldon. We're, fortunate to not only have you speak once, but twice, right? And so thank you again for your expertise too, and kind of helping us understand such a complex situation right now. So I know you said
Well,
you don't have a ton of optimism, but that's okay, right?
yeah,
Um,
I'm going to be giving outlook talks throughout the next 3 or 4 months. So fingers crossed that things start to improve somewhat, particularly for soybean producers, because I didn't mention this, but I think the federal government is going to have to provide some additional compensation to farmers because they are really in a difficult position right now, especially if they're a row crop farmer. And the benefits of we don't have a new farm bill. That's still up in the air. And even if we did, any payments for farmers to compensate them for what they may be getting this year won't come in until from a year back from now. That's one of the peculiarities of the US farm legislation. So I think we're going to see a lot of pressure on the agricultural committees in both the Senate and the House in Congress to try to help out farmers because they're under a lot of pressure right now, and it doesn't look very good right now, at least in the short term. But we'll just wait and see
Well,
and
maybe we
hope
can
that.
follow up with you again, if this situation kind of continues to be a policy issue. Maybe we can have you back a third time. Give us another update.
Sure, very happy to do so. So thanks very much for asking me. Hope that was useful, and I'll be very happy to send my slides down to you.
Awesome.
Take care. Have a good day.
Thank you. Everyone have a good day.